hitting the record. Perfect. Thank you very much. And for everybody else, we are recording this session and posting it on our website. This is part of a 5-webinar program, actually 6. If you joined us the last go around, I think it was about a week ago, we did the kickoff, which was an overview of our entire plan for how to prioritize your ARPA resources and start thinking about all the various polls that you have for the resources at hand. And I'll explain that thesis here in just a second. So the idea was we kicked off about a week or so ago. Today, we're going to have a deep dive into this very first tier of the plan, which is for all of our communities who are really needing to make sure we have resources immediately available for people, business owners, small businesses, people in need. How do we start to think about that? And next week, we'll get into tier 2, tier 3, and so on, and cover the rest of the plan overall. Liz is posting in the chat, if you're able to see this, some of our attachments that were in Liz's email yesterday, some of the materials, especially for those of you who were not working with. We have provided some worksheets so that you can still develop some of the data along with us, and we'll make sure to hit on that. We have a mixture of current clients and people we've never interacted with before. So we've tried to design these workshops to be practical for both audiences. We're going to show how to use priority-based budgeting data that our current clients develop in order to work our way through the 5-tiered plan. But for those of you who have never developed such data, we'll get into, well, where do you start? How do you put some of this data together? And that's what Liz has posted in the chat for everybody else to start to follow along. So hopefully this is super practical. I am going to have a little bit of presentation time, and then the idea is to stop frequently and engage with you all and start to hear about how you're approaching the situation at hand. So in our kickoff, if you missed it, I'm going to try to summarize it here in about one slide. Our position paper on the ARPA resources comes from our interaction with some of our clients who are saying, man, this is an incredible blessing that we have these resources coming. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity in so many ways, and such a transition from what we were facing last year. And at the same time, while it's a blessing, it's also not without its challenges by way of the tensions that our decision makers are feeling on how and where to use the money, how to prioritize it. So we outlined, you have everything from people who need relief right now, they need resources immediately, small businesses as well, coupled with the tension of prudent financial planning, not using one-time money, for example, to fund ongoing needs, and being cautious and practical, making sure that we are replenishing reserves for those of our organizations who had to dip into reserves last year. Not everybody did, but some of us did. And so that is a pull on the use of these resources. We see headlines even this morning about communities who are jumping towards restoring program cuts that they made last year, that might represent your top priority. And we have other communities who are saying, forget last year, we need to be future focused and really thinking about this once in a lifetime opportunity to deploy resources towards some of our biggest needs and creating the type of community that we want to be overall. So we recognized, man, these are not all the same use of funds. And so we wanted to create a game plan to say, how do you divide and conquer for all of these competing interests? And that is the nature of the plan that we put together. Our plan, as we covered in the kickoff, is a 5-tiered plan. There's probably more competing interests for the resources that you have. But as an overview, we were dividing it into a short-term strategy for needs for your resources right away, making sure we are understanding what the best use of those resources are for tier one, people who need the resources right away. Tier two, building back those reserves and doing some emergency budget stabilization for those organizations who are in this position where you had to dip into reserves, or you funded programs last year using some of your reserve dollars, and now you're trying to wean your dependency on those one-time resources. And then we start to get into a transition in our strategy heading into tier three, which is how do you start to think about amending your current budget to possibly consider program restoration, anything that you cut last year, and how do you think through, well, maybe some of those cuts were things that you want to preserve, or maybe you want to reallocate resources and not just jump to restoring programs, and yet other programs are absolutely a high priority to restore. So this becomes the transition from immediate needs to more forward-thinking strategies with the resources. We then move into tier four and tier five, which is complete long-term planning and really epic uses of the resources. How can you recognize that you are not alone in your region, most likely, in terms of others who have received or who are about to receive ARPA resources? How can we leverage all that we are receiving among our partners, and also thinking about really bold investments into objectives and priorities of your future, like equity or infrastructure or climate or your economy. And so our overall game plan is you want to have resources, if possible, if at all possible, for all of these tiers, but we have to start almost Maslow's hierarchy style somewhere, and that's going to be the focus of today, is how to really understand tier one. It sounds easy at its surface level. We have to take care of people in need who need immediate relief, but I'm sure in your communities, if you look at any newspaper article or among many of our clients, tier one is also not obvious. We need to get ideas on the table, understand what we can use the money to do, and prioritize and see what we get. So that's what we're going to be focused on today. And just again, to remind you, our next session in the program next week, we'll focus on the tier two strategy. And then the week after that, we'll get into tier three, tier four, and tier five. All along the way, Liz is developing worksheets, and she's posting those in the chat for handouts and materials for any of our attendees today who have never worked with us before. We definitely want to make this practical for you as well. And also for our current clients, we're going to be talking about workshops that are readily available and things that we can also assist with, or that you can run on your own. All right, let's talk about tier one. How do we start to think about where resources need to go right away? This is the type of reaction that we're starting to see: stimulus command centers, stimulus advisory boards popping up as organizations are starting to think through how are we going to get a group of people to consider ideas and prioritize funding. I don't think we have Andy Crawford on the call right now, but she is managing a stimulus command center, and she comes from Lansing, Michigan. So as we're thinking about, like, okay, we're some of our organizations are getting resources right away, amending the budget. Others are setting up things like stimulus advisory boards to consider proposals. We were trying to frame the problem and first off, establish that our goal is to arrive at your best, your most impactful recommendations that are going to benefit your most vulnerable populations, and do so as quickly as possible. We want to move from, yes, we need to help people, to what exactly are we going to do? What programs are we going to change? What projects are we going to fund? And how are we going to do this as quickly as possible? How do you even settle on who are your most vulnerable populations, and what programs are you offering right now that help them, that you could bolster? So that's our objective. Our challenges include where to start, Our challenges include avoiding duplication or redundancy with other aspects of ARPA. So we covered this in our kickoff last week, but the idea that there are different buckets of money, and if at all possible, you want to use your direct stimulus, your direct support in a way that doesn't overlap other buckets of money. Another challenge and also a recommendation is not trying to tackle every strategy at once. Part of the reason we did the 5-tiered approach is to try to divide all of your uses of ARPA resources so that you can focus on specific strategies and specific purposes. So sometimes the response or the use of ARPA funds can be paralyzing if you're trying to think through, well, we need to help people in immediate relief, and we need to handle our reserve replenishment, and we need to be thinking big and long-term. So this is part of our approach, is we're just going to try to divide these pieces up again, and focusing here on tier 1. Our approach to be able to achieve this goal and address these challenges is to, for priority-based budgeting clients, we're going to start with mining the program data that you have and looking for opportunities, things that you're doing right now that are serving vulnerable populations and people in need. And if you don't have program data, no problem. Your step 1 is create program data if you don't have it. And then we'll be able to begin to mine those opportunities. Step 2, we're going to get into applying that data essentially and conducting what we call an insight workshop. And the purpose of the insight workshop is to generate and maximize these recommendations. They'll start at the program level, and we want to get as many really high quality recommendations on the table as possible and as quickly as possible so that we can begin to prioritize. It's also another kind of sub-thought or footnote here is how we consider potentially public involvement in the creation of insights. And that is probably time sensitive for some of your communities, and also coming up with a practical means to invite the public to generate ideas, but it's a welcome notion. And third, once you have recommendations, how are you actually going to move towards establishing approval? We have some clients who are creating budget amendments to do this. Others, like we mentioned, are developing advisory boards or stimulus command centers in order to get an approved recommendation funded and moving forward and executed. So I'm sure there are many other elements of a strategic approach, but these are the areas that we're going to focus in on. And then timeline considerations. We have some organizations who are really needing to have this strategy set like within 30 days, or some organizations who are actively taking budget amendments to their councils right now. So they're moving lightning fast and committing to resource allocation as quickly as possible. We get it. So we had our timeline design approach was to consider how to accomplish this approach within 30 days, or more practically, within a 30 to 60 day time period overall. So what is that truly, what do I mean by that? We want to make sure that you can mine your program data or create it if you don't have it, the basics of program inventory and considerations about how you provide those programs, and conduct an insight workshop in order to have recommendations within this period of time overall. All right. My last intro slide, and then I'm going to get into some demonstrations of mining the data. So for all the tensions that we had covered, I wanted to simply say by program data, what we mean by that is leveraging your line item resource data, where your budget goes today, slipping in a program inventory, what it is that we actually do, what do your departments provide, what are the services that you actually offer, and who do they serve, tagging these programs with basic program attributes. So coming to learn the basics about the programs that you're thinking of changing. Are they mandated? What do the mandates say? Are they federally mandated? Are they state mandated? Is it something in our own charter? Who do they serve? Do they serve vulnerable populations? Do they serve the majority of our citizens? Is there any cost recovery for these programs coming in? We're suggesting that upon a program inventory, there is basic metadata that you want to know about what you provide, data on data, in order to help you as you're considering how you identify programmatic change recommendations for Tier 1, those programs that are serving people who need relief right away. You can continue to layer as you think about the impact that your programs have on outcomes in your community. So outcomes could be economic vitality. And if you're thinking about small businesses in need of resources right now, you might want to understand, well, what programs do we offer today that actually serve our economic interests? So that is good data on your program inventory to be able to have. And overall, shifting from only having line item business intelligence, which is what all of us have, that's our budget, to more programmatic or service level business intelligence. And it's upon this data that we can start to get into insight workshops and coming up with the recommendations that we're advocating for in Tier 1. Okay, that's the intro. And now I'm going to toggle out of the slides and into some data. So let's talk about data. And for those of you who are priority-based budgeting implementers, we're going to be talking about where to begin as you're starting to mine the various programs and services that you already have and search through them for programmatic opportunities. And those of you who don't have program data yet, don't worry, we're going to wrap up towards the end of this session by talking about how do you build your own program inventory, but it's almost like a begin with the end in mind for you all who have never done this before. How do you get the right programs on the table? This is a dive into our portal where our clients are developing a program inventory, doing resource allocation to programs, and beginning to tag programs with basic program attributes, mandate, population served, and so on, as well as results. And I'm actually going to jump into this light bulb, which is a portal towards program insights, because it's a handy way to begin to search the data. And I just want to begin to show you with your program data, especially for those who have it, how mining that data starts to get specific and interesting programs on the table for consideration. So here, this is a list of all of the programs across a particular organization, and we could subset it by any of their departments if we wished. I'm just going to look at the entire organization. This is a list of everything they do, from animal care and control to arson investigations to bank and treasury management offered in finance overall. And for Tier 1, which is people in immediate need of relief, we have some communities who are saying small business support is on our minds. It's one of the things that we want to take a look at. So as I start to type in small business in this particular organization, we do see very interestingly equity and contracting, which is a procurement program. And right off the bat, that might not have been the very first place I would have thought to focus if I was thinking about people in need right away, is our own internal equity and contracting procurement program. But this is a great idea. The idea here is starting to focus on what the city is buying, and does this program need any additional support as they're considering being hyper-focused on your own small businesses and your own local businesses for the services that they're providing overall. Super great idea, provide them business. I'm gonna search for economic and just see what comes up. So here I'm thinking about anything to do with bolstering local economic development. And we do have basic economic development, how we're working within the community and the local chamber of commerce to advance our business needs overall. This might not have been on my radar, and I'm hoping that I'm starting to begin to show you by mining program data, I'm trying to unearth current initiatives, current programs that we offer that may be eligible for this tier one direct support for those most in need. Staying on the economic front or the business front, I might look at equity. And we talked about equity and contracting. Here we have equitable service analysis, outreach and partnerships. Fascinating. This is starting to recognize how we're working with other entities, other nonprofits in our community. We have our workforce equity initiative overall. That's fascinating. What sort of retraining skills will that qualify for people who are immediately in need? In this community, we just talked about the story last week. This is here in Pittsburgh, where they have a local parking authority that is definitely in need. The parking authority has been hit really hard by the economic downturn last year. Revenues are severely down, and there's a lot of question of whether or not the authority will be able to stay in business. And so as it pertains to outreach and partnerships, are there any mechanisms for direct support to keep that authority afloat, because they are not getting ARPA resources? And there's the possibility that if the authority goes under, the city will be inheriting those responsibilities for maintaining all the infrastructure and running parking, and that might not be something that they want to do. So we have found mining the data using some of the keywords that I'm showing you here starts to unearth places to start, programs that might not have been obvious that are in need of resources immediately to start to meet those needs for our tier one priority. And the last one I'll look at is housing. We've heard a lot of our communities are thinking about how they're approaching their affordable housing, how they're approaching rent relief and homelessness. Here are some of the housing programs that come up here in Pittsburgh overall. So we need a place to start. Program data is going to be our most helpful starting place to start to consider this conversation. As another example, I'm going to move into, this is Boise, Idaho. So they have the exact same data, all of their departments, all of the programs within every department that they provide. So they put their data together. And one of the interesting things that Boise did, and it's proving, it could prove very helpful for the situation at hand right now. I had mentioned that we tag programs with basic program attributes. And for those of you who are current implementers, you have this data. So you can filter on things like how, if we wanted to look at only the programs we provide that are mandated by the federal or state government, we could quickly subset the entire organization's budget and all programs provided based on those that are federally mandated. If I wanted to look at programs that serve the greatest portion of our community overall, every program was tagged with this data. So I could click on those programs that serve the entirety of the community. And now it's again a subset of everything that they do, because not every program serves or benefits everybody. Or I could look at programs that serve a very small portion of the community and subset on that data. And that might be interesting to start with. But I'm just showing you how you can begin to filter. What Boise did is they tagged every program based on vulnerable populations. And if you can see my screen, they honed in on this specific criteria. And I wanted to show that to you. So they said, we are categorizing programs. They scored a 4 in their system that are geared specifically to benefit vulnerable, disadvantaged, or at-risk members of our community. So they're already, they had begun to do this over the last few years. They're already tagging every program and service that meets this criteria, versus on the other end of the spectrum, program does not provide a direct or indirect benefit to vulnerable, disadvantaged, or at-risk members of the community at all. So you could do process of elimination and choose these programs and say, we're not using ARPA funds right away for tier one as it pertains to programs that really have nothing to do with our most vulnerable. Or they could select and subset on those programs that are geared specifically to benefit vulnerable, disadvantaged, or at-risk members of their community. And as I come up to actually look at the departments and the programs that they serve that meet this category, lo and behold, here, as I've clicked into planning and development services, we do have our rental housing programs overall, our home improvement loans and permanent housing loans and home ownership loans. So these are direct support programs overall for the city of Boise that they could really start to jump in and think through, man, these are probably very eligible for serving people who are most vulnerable, at risk, and do these have the resources that they need? Is this an awesome area to level up on what we're providing for these programs right away? Here's their fair housing program. They have their homelessness program that is currently not funded at a very high level whatsoever. And some of these are in partnership. Here's Boise and Ada County for continuum of care. So here's as well where they're starting to think through, here's something that we're doing, we're barely funding it. Is this a great option or opportunity to start making sure we have the resources made available from our ARPA funds for Tier 1 programs that support people in immediate need? What's neat as you start to come through this for Boise, they did a great job of tagging their programs with this vulnerable populations criteria. Almost every program that comes up seems like it's a light bulb moment for understanding where resources could be deployed, even to victim services within their legal department, various library programs, Office of the Mayor has a few as well. And your takeaway, what I hope that you're thinking about, is that the way that they got here was by identifying a program inventory and going through and tagging programs that meet this criteria, programs geared specifically to benefit vulnerable, disadvantaged, or at-risk members of the community. We would recommend that you take a screenshot of this, or if you are a PBB implementer that has never tagged your programs with this information, it's a departmental exercise where departments are using their program inventory data and starting to think through, does my program meet a score of 4 for vulnerable populations? Would I tag it with a 3, where the program is not geared specifically towards assisting vulnerable, disadvantaged, or at-risk portions of the community, but has provisions available for these members like scholarship programs, so some partial support? It was a great criteria for Boise to use, and we're bringing it up because it fits within that 30-day design timeline consideration, that having departments score their programs this way would not take long. You might want some peer review or quality control or a second set of eyes to verify that these scores are appropriate. But what you're going to end up with is now a list of programs that would be eligible for your Tier 1 use of ARPA resources overall. All right. So I talked about our general plan, and our thesis here was to start to think through mining your program data to look for these types of opportunities. And secondly, move into a program insight workshop. And this is something that is built into our tools for organizations who are thinking about doing this on your own. The concept is applying program data. That's going to be the information that we use, our greatest tool, and start to develop recommendations in a very short period of time. You want recommendations to come from departments? Absolutely. They are on the front lines. They know your most vulnerable populations probably the best. We'd also consider, is there a chance to invite a citizen committee? If you are establishing a stimulus advisory board or something of that nature, might this be a good opportunity for some of those participants to start creating insights as well? But insights are just things that we might do differently. And the vehicle for change is the program and service level. That's why we just spent time establishing that you want to have this data to bring to bear. But now we're going to work into, okay, now assuming you have this data, how does this flow? What kind of insights are you hoping to generate? So the flow of an insight workshop goes in 3 steps, and that's what I'm pointing you to up here. There is step 1, create an insight. So using any of the programs that your departments have, if I was a departmental participant, the concept is I'm going to find a program that I think is eligible or should be competing against some of the other proposals for tier 1 funding of our ARPA resources. And I'm going to make a recommendation at the program level. My recommendation needs to come with a basic notion or description about what my idea is all about, but not too far. It's a minimum specs, a min specs approach to say, I have the seed of an idea, I want it put on the table for consideration, and I'm trying to maximize as many possible ideas as I can and get them all on the table. Step 2 is then to take any of those initial ideas and work them through some more specific questions that you would want to have. So no different than a budget development request process. You want to have a set of questions that refine the insight, that refine the recommendation, so that decision makers could really have something to consider as they're looking at all possible uses for ARPA funds as they pertain to tier 1. And then finally, step 3 in this process is actually a recommendation. It's built into the tools, but for those of you thinking about doing this in your own workshop setting, but you want a feedback mechanism. You want decision makers or stimulus advisory board members to be able to say, I think I get your idea. I actually might need some more clarification. I deny your idea. I don't think it fits in whatsoever. That's the basic approach. Step 1, step 2, step 3. And I do think it takes the shape of a budget development request process where you are actually trying to solicit your best ideas that meet the criteria for tier 1. Who are the people in need? What's your programmatic idea? How can we give you some feedback or ask some more clarifying questions? And again, our goal was that you end up with a list of vetted recommendations that you can begin to prioritize and think, are we going to allocate ARPA resources to these, make a budget amendment, try to get these funded and move forward. So I want to show you how this workflow is set up. And I will start with one of the programs that we were just looking for. So I think we had, I had worked up a demonstration of economic development. And this was working with local businesses here in Pittsburgh. And if I click on create for my insight, I had actually done a practice one. And I think it helps to show what some of the detailed information includes. So this was consider direct assistance and rent relief for small business tenants who are struggling. We incorporate some of the things that your decision makers are going to want to consider is a degree of complexity. Is this something that's going to be very hard to do to give direct assistance to small business tenants? I scored it low on complexity, but you're basically trying to get a sense from the person who is submitting the idea. Is this going to be very hard? Is it politically challenging? Is it contentious? And these can be subjective or they can be very specific, and you can customize as well for some of the specific language. Timeline, is it short-term or long-term? Again, up to your definition. Short-term is, immediate term is what tier 1 is all about. It's how can we get our resources from the federal government, deploy them right away. So you're gonna hope that most of the insights that are developed are of a short-term nature. And what is the recommendation? Am I asking for new funding here? In this case, yes. It's an increased service level for this particular program, giving direct assistance for rent relief. Just in my example, I'm estimating $2 million in direct assistance. And I want to point you to some of the fields in the insight categorization. This is really critical that we are establishing This is a one-time level of investment. The ARPA resources are one-time in nature. If your departments or the people submitting them are listing something that might be more ongoing in nature, hey, I'm starting a program where I intend to give this direct assistance year upon year. You want to be able to have this information distinguished as you're evaluating the proposals and saying, we don't want to get ourselves into trouble if we could at all avoid it by committing ourselves to ongoing funding. Are we adding staff to this program who next year at this time we're going to have to reconsider? Are we going to keep that position because we used one-time funding for it? So here in my recommendation, I've said this is a one-time stimulus. It's $2 million. This is the basic notion of the idea. I would click save. I could add more insights to this program. The concept is my departments and anybody else participating are now flooding my inbox with program insights and all various types of ideas that are coming forward. And that is, again, what step one is all about: maximize high quality ideas. As we move to step two, this is where we have a refinement approach, where we're saying, all right, the initial ideas have come in. This economic development idea is great, but I have some refining questions that I think you're going to want to ask as well. Again, these can be customized, but let me show you by way of an example. We're looking for some basic particulars. Here we're saying, please further explain why you're recommending this particular use of ARPA resources, and the department might let you know it's not redundant with the rental relief program already established in ARPA, and it relates directly with our economic vitality result. So I'm just getting some basics on the table. Again, this is what you're going to want to see in your proposals, in your reports. Please specify what needs to happen to ensure success. Funding would lead to A, businesses staying in business. That's crucial. And B, businesses not leaving. So that is part of this economic development program overall, was business retention. And C, commercial property owners also staying in business by having somebody paying their rent. Please specify who this change will impact: small business owners and their staff, commercial property owners and their staff. And additionally, please specify what resources are required. Here, maybe I'm starting to get into, this is a 3-month installment of rent relief, direct support based on certain criteria that we need to establish. So I'm admitting there's some fuzziness here. And most importantly, these are one-time funds. So trying to get very specific clarity on the nature of the recommendation so it can move forward towards your board or your decision-making body, or you who are fielding all of these requests for tier 1 recommendations. And then finally, here in approve is where we're hoping to get some more feedback from those who are evaluating these proposals. And we have the opportunity to approve and move this one forward and say, this is a really great idea and we want to consider it. We have the opportunity to click revisions needed, where you or your advisory board are giving the department or the recommender some feedback. And there's also the opportunity to deny. In this case, the selection was revisions needed, where you're starting to ask some basic questions. One, great question: will additional staffing be needed to process applicants for this funding? So the nature of this reviewer's question is, you say it's one-time money, and the one-time money is used for rent relief, but tell me more about the ongoing operational side of managing the deployment of these resources. Are we getting ourselves into anything that starts to seem like an ongoing expense, in this case, staffing to process the applications? Second, where will such staff be reallocated away from? What won't be getting done to absorb this work? So that's a great question. Are we reallocating someone's time from a current program? And if so, what program are we reallocating their time away from? And 3, how will we determine if another 3-month installment is needed? And what's the game plan? The whole point of going through this exercise was to show you we started with data. We started with programmatic data. and moved into an insight workshop to maximize high quality ideas and give them a review process to develop the idea from seed creation to clarifying questions and refinement to final approval and feedback, so that by the end, I can download a report of my recommendations. And here's my PDF for my economic development recommendation overall. And I'm actually going to download this and just show you how it works. The vision is you have this report, you're bringing it to your decision makers as they're thinking through as quickly as possible. Are there any other questions we need to be asking? The report is organized around insights that are on the table for recommendation, insights that are requiring some revision or some further questions, some basic graphics to identify what type of recommendation is coming forward. In this case, it's the economic development one was an increased service level. Some basic metrics on the total dollar amount that we're looking for, because hey, we don't know what ideas are going to come forward for all the various uses of the ARPA money. And that's the point of our recommendation for using an insight workshop is it's see what's going to come back and then begin to think through how are we going to prioritize these resources. And finally, if I wanted to click into the specifics, here I can go to the economic development recommendation and I see the feedback that was given. I see the nature of the recommendation in front of us. So starting to get into the details overall for reviewers to be able to take a look at. We're at about quarter till. I did want to stop for a moment and see, I know there's nothing in the chat, but welcome anybody to come off mute or talk in the chat about this particular process. Again, as we weave it all the way back to the use of ARPA resources for tier 1, how do you start to get our minds around who are the people in need? What are the programs that we could fund in order to support them, and how to invent a idea creation process and a decision-making flow to get some feedback on the recommendations that are coming forward overall. I'd love to take some questions, and then where I plan to wrap is the worksheet that Liz had left in the chat for those of you who are starting to think through creating your own program inventory data. Liz has designed this so that you can begin to list your own programs and conduct this in an ad hoc way, but at least a way that is useful, especially for those who have not implemented priority-based budgeting or have program data before. No questions. I'll just pause for just a second. I also would be curious, is anybody else doing a process like this right now, and how it's going? Are you starting to get recommendations for how to use ARPA resources for immediate relief? Do you have a decision-making flow or a prioritization process? Do you have a board or a committee or somebody who's reviewing these overall? I would just definitely be intrigued, either coming off mute or typing in the chat if you already have a framework like this. All right. Well, hopefully this is useful then. I did want to go back real quick and say, recall, this was the way that we have approached tier 1. First of all, that tier 1 is where we have to start before we can start thinking about big swings, leveraging partners, replenishing reserves. We wanted to establish that for those of you who want to make sure you have resources going out the door without a whole lot of planning for the long term, and you have people who are suffering today, how are you going to get a prioritized list of recommendations and begin to allocate resources? So that was our focus for this workshop. Our general design principles was we wanted to make sure that you're going to arrive at a list of recommendations who are serving those in need as quickly as possible. We didn't want to try to tackle everything at once. We wanted to mine our program data, conduct an insight workshop, and then ultimately with that report, begin to consider a budget amendment. Of all the given recommendations, can we afford it? When are we going to plug these in? And that this is something that we could tackle within 30 days if you had a rapid deployment. And thank you, Marianne, for commenting in the chat. And you're planning a listening session with the community. That's really awesome. I'm guessing it's going to take the form one way or another of listening to the community, getting some of their recommendations, and the Insight portal is probably a great place to start to document some of the ideas that they're coming up with. So the last section I wanted to hit, and then still have some time for some open dialogue, was what if you don't have program data? Marianne and Wausau, is creating their program inventory data as we speak. For others, you might be in a position where this is the first time that you're really thinking about this. And I was beginning to demonstrate the power of having program inventory information as you're searching for housing or equity or small businesses or women-owned or minority-owned businesses overall. That's what you want to be able to create. You can use this template that Liz inserted to identify by department a program description, a basic estimate of costs. So Liz has done a great job of setting this up for you so you can develop personnel costs and non-personnel costs. These are things that we do in our tools, but this is your general worksheet if you are able to start to organize your data. And then the other component of our design was to begin to tag programs with metadata. What might we know about the degree of mandate of a program? Degree of reliance starts to get into, are we the only possible provider of that program, or are there others in our community who provide it? Cost recovery, change in demand, population served. You can begin to tag programs as well with outcomes that they are oriented to achieve. And where I really wanted to get to was program insights. So the most simple tagging of programmatic opportunities. Does this serve a vulnerable population? Are we looking for a service level increase? Here's where you're going to be able to at least start to jot down in this worksheet programmatic opportunities that you might want to consider for tier 1. I did also want to say that we are doing, and Liz, if you wouldn't mind dropping this into the chat from our website, we have a prep course, a boot camp, if you will, a way to begin to lead organizations through envisioning their program data creation steps. And it's called the Resource Experience. And this is coming up. I think our next offering is June, that is hyper-focused on how to actually create the program level data overall. So hopefully all of the ARPA sessions that you're listening to are giving you the strategy. All of our strategies leverage program data as you're thinking of executing them. And for anybody who does not have program data overall, we're going to be offering that resource experience to actually create it. And maybe Liz already included it. I'm going to pause my screen real quick. And
I am including the information right now. So it'll.
Oh, thanks, Liz. That's great. Cool. Well, we do have just a few minutes left. I really appreciate everybody sticking around towards the end. And thanks for comments that Marianne, I'd be really interested in hearing more about your listening session, or anybody else who wanted to just talk openly about your initial strategies, especially as it pertains to tier one, but really anywhere. And then on top of that, just a reminder that we will be doing tier two coming up next week. So this was a process on how to address your immediate needs. Tier two is going to be about emergency budget stabilization and replenishing reserves. Liz just dropped in the chat with the advertisement for the resource experience for generating your program data. And I'll take a breather and just say, anybody want to talk about their approaches or get some general strategy? I know it's always like, New Hampshire, what's happening out there, Paul? Well, thanks a ton. We will continue the workshop series. Again, next week is emergency budget stabilization. How do we focus on a strategy that it says we have to replenish our reserves if you dipped into them last year? We don't want to use all of our ARPA resources just for reserve replenishment. We want to make sure we're addressing some in tier one and have some money left over for tier 3, 4, and 5. So can we consider multi-year replenishment of reserves? How do we get agreement on that? What about organizations who dipped into reserves last year? Those are one-time monies, and used those reserves to fund ongoing programs last year, so you didn't have to lay anybody off. As you now move into 2021, the question becomes, how do we, you already used the reserves one time, unless you were planning on funding those programs with reserves forevermore, we need to start making sure that those programs and staff members aren't dependent on those reserves. And that's what we're going to get into for tier two, the emergency budget stabilization and the use of resources to accomplish that strategy. Awesome. Well, thanks, Paul, for that comment overall. And thanks everybody very much for attending. And we really hope that you fill out the worksheet. If you need help on the worksheet, if you're thinking about developing a program inventory, please don't hesitate to be in contact with us. This is what we do. So Paul, I know this is new stuff to you, and I will just drop my email in the chat. If you wanted to think through how to develop a program inventory, we would be happy to talk about that. And for the rest of you, hope we see you next week for tier 2 strategies and beyond, and hope you found this useful. Thanks, everybody.